Friends, would you allow me to begin by telling you something about myself? Is that all right with you? Well, you all probably know that as of today, I'm considered a biologist, right? But I must tell you that I've never had a formal lesson in biology, not even in my school days. Because when I was young, and that was a long time ago, 1938, when I joined high school, there were two courses in science. One was called pure science, mind you, pure science, where you studied physics, chemistry. The other was called general science, when you studied biology and a little bit of physics and chemistry. So all the boys took what? Pure science. And the girls? General science. So I didn't even have biology at that level. That was the first time I went to school. My first love was mathematics. So when I was 12 years old, and I passed my high school when I was 12, I had done all the university mathematics. But I realized that I didn't understand it. I did it, and my interest in mathematics was spurred by my high school mathematics teacher. I still remember his name, Brij Vilas, and he was an excellent teacher. And he told us the excitement in mathematics. But I was too afraid, I was too young to ask him about some simple questions that bothered me, that I'll share with you in a moment. So he told us how to operate, how to solve questions in mathematics, which I did. So as I said, when I was 12, I had done all the university mathematics on my own. So when I did my BSc, my family assumed that I will go and do my master's in mathematics. But then I realized, I was old enough to realize that I really didn't understand mathematics. So I had some problems. So I went to my mathematics professor at Lucknow University, a man called Avdesh Narayan Singh. There are very few names that I remember, but these are some that I do. And I asked him, I said, "Sir, I have a problem." He said, "What's your problem? You've done so well in the exam." I said, "But I have a problem." "So what's your problem?" I said, "I don't understand why A plus B equals B plus A. A multiplied by B equals B multiplied by A. But A minus B doesn't equal B minus A. And A divided by B doesn't equal B divided by A." Valid question, I hope you accept. It bothered me no end. He said, "Get out of my room." So the next day, I said, "Let me give another try." I went to my calculus teacher, he was a reader, R.D. Mishra. And as I entered his room, he said, "What's the matter?" I said, "Sir, I have a problem." He said, "What's your problem? You've done so well in the exam." I said, "But I still have a problem." "So what's your problem?" I said, "Sir, I don't understand what dy by dx or delta y by delta x or d square y by dx square means." He said, "Get out of my room." You know, it took me another 20 years, and a good friend, some of you know her, the late Vanaja Iyengar, who spent the day with me and explained to me all the answers to these questions. But till that time, I didn't quite have the answers. And I realized that for a mathematics professor who was teaching calculus, not to know the difference between change and rate of change. That's what calculus is about. It's about the rate of change. That's what dy by dx means. So I think the reason I thought I'll begin with this personal experience is that there are very few teachers. Even at that time, the number of good teachers was small in the country. Today, we don't even have 1% of those very small numbers. And one of the most important reasons as why people don't go to science is that there is nobody there to satisfy their curiosity. I remember one day Satish Dhawan, when he was the chairman of SPACE, a very old friend, walked into my house, and my children were very fond of him. And my son, who was a few years old, asked Satish, he said, "Uncle, tell me, when I open the tap, why does the water go down and doesn't go up?" For a child, it's a perfectly legitimate question. And I remember Satish sitting for an hour and explaining to him, and after that, changed the whole perception of my son towards science. So, friends, I think it's very, very important to have good teachers. And one of the reasons why people don't go to science is that their questions, their queries are not answered. The teachers who don't know the answers, they themselves are not interested in what they are teaching. So that's first question. First reason. The second, perhaps far more important reason, and the most important reason, is who have access to education today. Please remember that over 95% of our people do not have access to good education. Even reasonable education, don't even say good, but reasonable education. Our government schools, which were at one time the best schools in the country, and even today the central schools are the best schools in the country. But leave aside central schools, our government schools are in shambles. There's no infrastructure. Right to Education Bill, which was passed a few years ago, we had said that it will never be implemented, it's unimplementable, has not been implemented. Today's newspaper tells you that almost all the states, they have not even met small percentage of requirements of RTE. So, today, those who have access to reasonable education are rich. And reasonable education is provided only by private schools. And remember, private schools, not counting trust-run schools, but private schools, most of them are set up to make money, not to give you good education. So at least on face of it, they have some infrastructure, they have some equipment, some material, but even there, the kind of teachers that we had in high school are simply not there. 97% of PhDs that we produce, they should have never been admitted to a PhD course. That's the situation today. 80% of engineering graduates are unemployable. If you take away the top 8 or 9 business schools, the rest of the 700, 800 business schools, 97% are produce unemployable graduates. That is the situation today that we have. So this question of access, I think, has many ramifications. If we have a situation where 95% of the population, which is not genetically inferior to the remaining 5%, does not have access to a good education, how do you expect them to be good at science or understand science? Not only that, those 5%, maybe 10%, take the outer limit, who have access to education, their value system is very different. They are the ones who are at the helm of corruption. Our schools teach corruption because your admission starts with corruption. So, the parents want their children to have money and power. They do not understand that Mahatma Gandhi had no authority. There's a difference between authority and power. Authority is what you have by the kind of position you occupy. Power is what you have because of what you are. So the parents want their children to have money and authority. Corruption runs in their veins. And remember, the value system that science generates, the practice of science generates, is completely different. Science demands truthfulness, honesty, integrity. And this is precisely what parents don't inculcate in their children today, that top 5%, the rich and the powerful. So why should the children go to science where the value system is totally contrary to what will allow them to make money and have authority? This is the single most important reason why children do not go to science. That is, we have excluded those 95%. And remember that these 95% whom we exclude are, if anything at all, genetically superior to us. They live under conditions, they survive under conditions where we would not be able to survive. And after all, what is intellectual ability? Is the ability to face problems and solve them. They do that. 11-year-old from a village can do a lot more things than 11-year-old from the urban areas where rich and powerful live. Those are the people who would be motivated not by corruption, not by money, not by authority, but by the desire to find out new things and to learn why are things happening. That's what science is about. So that is the second most important reason that we do not have a system which provides access to good quality, high quality education to everybody in the country. Ramanujan did not come from an affluent background. I wonder how many of you know that not many years ago, maybe a couple of decades ago, Ramanujan's wife was found washing utensils in a family in Tamil Nadu. That is the case with the wife of the greatest mathematician that the world has seen in the last century, this century. Third point, third reason, ignorance in our educated people. In fact, very few of us who have degrees are really educated. We are uneducated. In fact, if we really look at what education means, what does education mean? Is acquiring the ability to cope with the environment, find solutions to problems that we face every day in our lives. And that way, perhaps a farmer or a factory worker is more educated. My grandmother, who was not literate, was highly educated because she could solve problems. And she taught us how to solve problems, far more than we learned through our formal system of education. So I think this ignorance in the educated people, it makes them immune to what real knowledge is. If they were not immune to that, they will refuse to send their children to the so-called commercial private schools. The commercial private schools, with all the gloss that they have, they do not teach. They only ask you to mug up to pass an exam. They don't educate you. They don't make you knowledgeable. They don't make you capable of solving problems. And yet, we clamor for those schools because we have no alternative. Please remember that till the 1960s, the only schools we had were the government schools and the trust-run schools. There were no commercial schools. And these were exceedingly good schools. All our leaders of the last generation and some of the present generation are products of these schools, all the good leaders. We are all products of these schools. And there were some public schools, but those public schools were not one of them was set up to make money. The Doon School, the India School, the Mayo College, they were, yes, you paid money because they were residential schools. But they were not set up to make money. And you got real education there. Well, the situation is very, very different today. Next reason. Now tell me, how many of you believe in miracles? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Fair number. But the majority seems not to believe in miracles. I'm delighted at that. I think if you are committed to science, you know that no miracle has ever occurred. Never occurred. Science and miracles don't go together. And today, as it turns out, and it's interesting, contrary to what the situation was 60 years ago in India, the number of believers who believe that miracles can happen and things can happen which are outside of the scope of science, I think has increased very substantially. So what does this mean? So this concept goes totally against the grain of science. What does this mean? This means that you then begin to feel that if I have to choose between what science says and what perpetrators of miracles, the supposedly perpetrators of miracles say, I might actually believe the latter and not science. And I remember, I taught in Osmania University for 1 year, very few people know that. And I remember I met a professor of botany who taught the theory of evolution in the class, but taught creation to his children at school. Now the two are totally incompatible. Either you believe in creation or you believe in evolution. And the evidence in favor of evolution is so strong that to deny that will be really denying all of science. And if you deny science, then what is the motivation for studying science? You don't believe in what science tells you through the use of the scientific method. So that's another problem that we have today. Then teaching methodology. Oh, right. So the teaching methodology, I think in the context of today, needs to be completely changed. We today lay emphasis on facts and not on concepts. And science is really based on concepts. Facts are only there to support concepts. Concepts are not there to support facts, but facts are there supposed to support context. Now, let me give you an example. In 1970s, we wrote a book, a national textbook, for class 6. My distinguished friend, Balasubramaniam, was going to speak after me, was the co-author of that book. The book was called Learning Science, Part 1. It was for 11 to 12 years old. It was a national textbook. It was the prescribed national textbook for 12 or 13 years. Sold several million copies in English, Hindi and Urdu, 3 languages. In this book, we did not use the term physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics. It was an integrated textbook on science. Because nature doesn't say this is physics, this is chemistry, this is biology, and this is mathematics. Nature only poses problems. We compartmentalize knowledge very often. You know why? As an alibi for ignorance. So if you are a professor of zoology, then if I ask you to multiply 3.67 by 7.63, then so, but that's mathematics. I'm not supposed to know that. I'm a zoologist. Or if you are a professor of mathematics, then you are not supposed to distinguish between a dahlia and a rose, or a cow and a horse. So that becomes an alibi for ignorance. And when I was asked to be the chairman of the committee which wrote this book, I said to myself, the nature doesn't compartmentalize knowledge, we do it. So let's write a book in which we don't use the term physics, chemistry, mathematics. It was an integrated book. First chapter was mathematics, according to those who classify knowledge. The next chapter was not mathematics. So that was the first deviation from the norm. The second deviation was that we didn't have the titles that other books have. So other textbooks have elements and compounds. We had a chapter in which we talked about elements and compounds, but we called it materials around us, because materials around us are made of elements and compounds. And every chapter began with observations. Then what questions do these observations raise? Then how do we find an answer to that question? So you lead the student to the answer. Fourth part was, suppose I want to verify this answer, how do I do that? Experiments. And last step, which was very, very important, was how is it relevant to us in everyday life? These were, every chapter was divided into 5 parts. So we had this chapter on the elements and compounds, which we call the materials around us. And I want to read out to you what was the last part of this chapter in this book. And let me tell you that the book changed the lives of, I have wrote 1,000 letters and changed the lives of very large, several 100,000 people. They meet me today and talk to me about this with the chairman of companies and so on. So this last paragraph I do want to read, and I want you to listen to it carefully. It says, organization means restriction of freedom. But what are compounds? And compound elements are organized in certain ways. It says, we've learned that when elements come together to give compounds, that is, get organized, the properties of the elements change. Some properties are lost, but some are also gained. That is, the compound has some properties that none of the elements had. If we think a little, we will find that the same is also true of our society. We can compare ourselves to elements, and our family, our village or city, and our country to compounds. The family, the village or the city and the country can do many more things which are of benefit to us, than we can do as unorganized individuals. Can we name some of these benefits? For example, could we have had roads, trains and factories if each one of us were to work independently of the others? To obtain these and many more similar benefits, we must be prepared to work as a team and lose a part of our freedom, just as an element loses some of its freedom when it becomes a part of a compound. Now that's a part of a science textbook. So I think we simply today, while the rest of the world is discussing how do we communicate science to students at various levels and are gearing towards following the method of science, of observations, question, experiment, answer, and then social implications of what the answer is. When the rest of the world is turning towards this kind of this mode or this paradigm of teaching science, we are totally deviating from it. So that's another reason that I think people do not like to go to science. Then the question of syllabus. You know, the syllabus describes far too much in detail as to what we need to do. It doesn't leave any freedom for the teacher. And that's where we are very different from the rest of the world. Teaching in Britain, in France, in Germany, United States, I've lived in all these countries, and at least 40 to 50 other countries that I have visited and looked at their teaching system. We are the only ones who have this total lack of flexibility. Elsewhere, the teacher has a tremendous freedom to teach what he feels should be taught and how it should be taught. So the curriculum is mentioned, but the syllabus is not. Syllabus depends on the teacher. Curriculum gives you a broad framework of what really messages you want to convey. But this is not so. In fact, when we wrote this book, I had an enormous problem getting it through NCERT. And in fact, just then the change in government took place from Mrs. Gandhi to the Janata Dal government, Marathi Desai as president. And a committee headed by one Mr. Dr. Patel committee was appointed. And I was appointed to get rid of 3 books, our book, then Rumila Thapar's book and Sharma's book on history, and I think 1 book on mathematics. Fortunately, our book survived, and I don't know how it survived. So it continued to be the national textbook. And one of the criticisms was that it doesn't have any botanical names, it doesn't have the kind of details that a person was supposed to memorize. Our idea was that the book, nothing needs to be memorized. You understand, and that's all that was required. You don't have to memorize. So we compromised, and we put them all in the appendix, in the appendices. So the appendices have all the botanical names and so on, which I myself don't even know. So I think this is another problem that drives away the really brilliant, creative individuals who want to understand and not to cram up knowledge. So that's another problem that we have. Then the question of experiments. Science is all about experiments. In fact, the revolution in the last century in biology was from descriptive it became experiment after this determination of the structure of DNA. So we don't do experiments. And I remember when I was at high school student, almost every day we had an experiment in the class. And sometimes some of us, in fact, there were laboratory assistants whose job was to set the experiments before the teacher came to teach in the class. But where are these experiments today? I don't know if anyone of you remember the Method of Science exhibition that was set up in the 1980s in Hyderabad, 1970s in Delhi. It went through a very checkered history. It was stolen, set up by the government. Our government asked us to set it up. It was stolen by the government. It was court cases involving 3 prime ministers. Finally, it came to Hyderabad and was set up in the public library, the rear portion of the Hyderabad Public Library. And one of the reasons of the tremendous success of this exhibition, when it was on, it was subsequently filmed by Films Division. We wrote the commentary to it. That was shown on national television. It was recently shown in Trivandrum as a showpiece from India in the International Festival of Short and Documentary Films. And the success of this exhibition was the experiments that a person coming to see the exhibition could do the experiment himself or herself. And one of the experiments was, which people keep on reminding me, those who worked as volunteers in that exhibition are now grown up. As I said, some of them are chairmen of companies. One experiment which people recall was a time reaction. That we had 2 colorless liquids and you mix them, and the prediction was that at 19 plus minus 1 second, the picture will become immediately, instantly black, actually violet. And people loved it. And then they asked, why plus minus 1? I said, that's your personal error, because you don't start the stopwatch exactly at the same time when you mix it. So, and that had a tremendous impact on people. And experiments which magicians do, and the science behind those experiments. We had those experiments as well, where people could actually see why and how things happen. So we just don't do experiments, don't teach people experiments at all. So that's another problem that we have. Then our mode of teaching does not emphasize the
a method that science uses to acquire. That is question, hypothesis, experiment, and answer. The 4 key steps of the method of science. The question is based on either something new that you observed or a new analysis of existing data, based on observational analysis. Hypothesis must be testable. Then experiment you do, you collect everything that you need to do in experiment. And then you keep on doing the experiment, new experiments, until you can't think of an experiment that will disprove the hypothesis. Then your hypothesis becomes the answer. So that is the method that science uses to acquire knowledge. And so we don't teach people the value of the method of science and how you can use this method to in your everyday life. Now, in this exhibition, we had a short film made by P.V. Satish. It was one of the very early films made when Doordarshan was set up as Doordarshan Upgrah Kendra, Satellite Center Doordarshan. 4-minute film. The film began with a scene where a young girl walks into her room, presses the button of the table lamp, and the table lamp doesn't light up. And she shouts, "Another power cut." The older sister comes and puts the switch of the light in the room, and the light comes. No power cut. And then she takes out the bulb and finds the bulb is fused. So see, the first girl came to the wrong conclusion without doing an experiment. The second girl, the older girl, came to the right conclusion by doing the right experiments. I think these are examples that can be very effective. We never use these examples in our method of teaching. So we don't make people realize that this method that science uses to acquire knowledge is something you can use in your everyday life. It develops an attitude of mind which takes you away from biases and leads you to an answer which will stand the test of time. We don't do that at all. Then there's a tremendous contradiction between what science tells us and what the whole society is full of irrational beliefs. Astrology, completely, totally unscientific, there's no scientific basis whatsoever. And yet how many believe in astrology? I wonder how many of you, when the morning newspaper comes, look at the prediction for the day for your birthday. I must tell you, I also do that, but I do that for fun. But it never turns out to be right. Or it always turns out to be right, depending on how you look at it. So, and you see, this is a serious matter because when you are in a country where a vast majority of scientists believe in unscientific practices, you have a problem. When we filed a case, a colleague of mine, Channa Chakravarti, who many of you will know, for her acting in one of the Telugu films, or several of the Telugu films, when she and I filed, Anand I think is one of them, when she and I filed a petition in the Supreme Court, which actually was admitted against astrology, teaching of astrology in universities as a subject, none of the scientific academies supported us. Not one. The Indian National Academy of Science, Indian Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Sciences, Indian National Science Academy, not one of them supported us. In fact, the only scientist who supported us at that time was Yashpal, who has constantly, never wavered, and constantly has been always scientific. So he doesn't lead two lives. Same is true of homeopathy. When I gave it at the press conference, I think some of you would remember some years ago, it was some press conference I was invited, and I commented on irrational systems of medicine. And next day, some 500 homeopaths came out to kill me. Now they've been killed. The police haven't arrived. Arrived 10 minutes late. Instead of engaging in a debate, they just came out on the streets and said, "We'll kill Dr. Bhargava." Our lives are governed by rational systems and rational beliefs. In such an atmosphere, science cannot flourish. And people will not quote science because science actually stands out in direct and stark contradiction to all the irrational beliefs. So that's another major reason why we do not have people going towards science, because when the parents don't believe in science, they believe in all that is anti-science, how will they push their children, even if they want to, into science? Then, worse than that is the lack of the commitment of the government to education, and even their lack of commitment to scientific education. In fact, the government is committed to unscientific practices. So first, the government is not committed to education, and secondly, whatever commitment is there is to unscientific practices. As I said that till the 1960s, the only schools we had were the government schools, exceedingly well run, called trust service schools. Today, the government schools are in complete shambles. I will again urge you to read this morning's report about the status of government schools, because by 31st March 2013, all the provisions of the Right to Education Bill were supposed to have been followed, and not even 5% have been followed. So where is the government's commitment to education? But on the other hand, as I said, allow me to repeat myself, commitment is to unscientific practices. Please give me one reason why the Prime Minister of India and the Chairman of the National Advisory Council, and I know both of them personally extremely well, had to go to Puttaparthi when